Next gaming session. So we found ourselves in an unusual situation for our group. For the first time since the angel had been kidnapped, our dragon shaman wasn't interested in pursuing her trail directly. His rationale was that by this point, she's either dead due to that being the plan anyway, or alive due to them needing her that way for whatever they were getting ready to do. The way we had hit multiple ports all within a week of each other meant that we weren't actually that far behind the group at large. We still don't know what Thurin did, or where he went, and we still don't know what, if anything, was up with the unidentified fifth man. We do know that they now have a whole mess of black onyx, a live angel, and a new strain of stronger spellcasting bugs. We knew that the ziggurat we were in had caused mutations. It's even possible that the drifter's insect's wings were from prolonged exposure to the ziggurat, and not from some class or spell specifically, and that the mutations had probably been changing what the spellcasting bugs did. It occurred to the factotum that the vampiric touch casting bugs were the first ones we'd encountered that were using necromancy spells. Between that and the black onyx, well, we still don't know what exactly is going on, but it's starting to look like it's all definitely connected, and it's definitely something we don't want to let happen. At the same time, the drifter is flying under his own power. He doesn't have the wind at his back speeding up the process, and even when he gets to the continent, he's probably still going to have to set things up. Making a side trip to the Empire continent will only change our target destination by just under 2 weeks. Since we'll be avoiding docking at a major port, to get us closer to the city Mercy Glade is contained in, it'll only be a day's flight by bat. We all agree that, whatever else is going on, we need to know more about Priest and hopefully find out how to shut down those returning fighters of his. So that's what we all collectively agree, for the first time in quite a while, needs to happen. We set sail northward, bringing us close to, but not directly on, the coastline of the temperate continent. We pick an area that's give or take near where Mercy Glade is, tell the skeletons to circle in the waters, but to avoid any other ships, and take to the skies, flying in over the forest. Thankfully, zombie bats don't get tired, so a few hours later we were still coasting along happily, and spotted the outskirts of a major metropolitan city. The city wasn't our destination though. Mercy Glade was an asylum, built a decent way outside of the city directly. No one wants lunatics in their backyard, after all, on a mountainside facing away from the city itself. Don't want the lunatics looking out the windows and getting ideas, after all. So we steer further north and come in low, flying just over the treetops. Eventually, we spot our destination a few hundred yards off into the distance. And right around this time, a giant rock comes hurtling through the trees and nails the underside of my bat, finally knocking it down to 0 hit points and sending me and my dead mount tumbling out of the sky and onto the hard ground. Fortunately, we were only 50 feet up or so I survived the fall damage. Unfortunately, I was essentially helpless, laying on the ground next to a large dead bat, and watching the lumbering hill giant running awkwardly towards me and cheering about how he caught his dinner. He was still around 200 feet off, out of range of a lot, but fortunately I nailed him with an eldritch spear. Unfortunately, I rolled horribly and barely annoyed his hit point total. I was still able to spider climb at will, assuming I could drag myself, 5-foot move rate, to one of the trees, 20 feet away, before the hill giant came up and started pummeling me into pulp with his club. The option sounded less than ideal. Fortunately, the next round of combat involved the dragon shaman calling for the swashbuckler to throw him his rapier, catching it in midair, and flying off the bat to make a charging/piercing dive attack for double damage, which was more than my puny blast had done. The factotum and swashbuckler both landed their respective bats in the treetops and jumped down to help us out, but used all of their actions doing so. Which meant it was the giant's turn again. He opened with a full attack on the dragon shaman, hit both times, and took over half of the dragon shaman's hit point total off in a single round, when we'd barely scratched him. I was still laying in the brush a few hundred feet away, so all I could do was eldritch spear another blast into the giant's face, rolled better this time, at least, and send my normal-sized bats flying in to try to create a distraction. The dragon shaman took off flying in a justifiable panic, as one more full attack would send him into negatives, but he hit the hill giant for a good chunk of fire damage from his fire breath too. The swashbuckler closed the distance and made a two-handed true striking power attack, thank God, for a massive chunk of damage, and the factotum circled around to get into flanking position and made a really sturdy sneak attack. We all kind of winced, because it was the giant's turn again, and frankly, the two combatants still in range were not built to take full attacks form great club wielding giants. Worse, the giant, being angry about the sneak attack, elected to open his full attack on the kobold. Now, I may have mentioned this, but between his size, various bonuses, ACT, our kobold actually has the highest AC in the group. The way the giant rolled was actually 2 near misses, effectively rendering the giant moot for his turn. I told the kobold he needed to run, because the giant could actually reasonably roll well enough to send the kobold to -10 in a single turn. The kobold just shook his head and stayed in flanking position. I fired off another Eldritch Blast, feeling for all the world like a portable turret system, and rolled another good hit of damage. The Dragon Shaman used a good portion of his healing touch to bring himself above the one-shot kill range and circled into position for another dive attack. The Swashbuckler made another two-handed true striking power attack, for another beautiful damage roll. The Factotum made another sneak attack, but rolled poorly and didn't really do much damage. Wince. Giant's turn. Frustrated with the kobold, the giant makes a full attack against the Swashbuckler instead. And he elects to mimic his assailant in kind, two-handed power attacking him. In one turn, he knocked him from full hit points, to -8. The DM described it as just a steroid-fueled Major League Baseball slam that literally sent the Swashbuckler tumbling heels overhead, over heels overhead, over heels, ACT, backwards and spinning out unconscious into the grass. I fire another Eldritch Blast. The Dragon Shaman, being too far from the Swashbuckler to help, elects to make another dive attack for double piercing damage. The Swashbuckler bleeds out to -9 and fails his stabilization check. Fortunately, the kobold has his ridiculous move speed, and is everywhere we need him to be, because he cleared the gap between himself and the Swashbuckler with move to spare, and used his last inspiration point to bring the poor guy up to 4 hit points. Swashbuckler, 4 whole hit points? I could kiss you. Except the Factotum's inspiration has run dry. Wince. Giant's turn again. He initiates a charging bull rush against the Dragon Shaman, who is currently airborne, a size category smaller, and not really all that strong. Yeah, the giant blew the Dragon Shaman's opposed check out of the freaking water, and pushed him back effortlessly back something like 100 feet. I won't lie, I had a moment of temporary cowardice. The hill giant was now closer to me than he was to the kobold and Swashbuckler, and our Dragon Shaman didn't really have much meat to bring to this fight. And I was prone and helpless. I seriously considered trying to drag myself to a tree to climb up it instead of continuing an attack. But I wound up shaking my head and firing off another Eldritch Blast all the same. 1, 1, 1, 1, 2. Talk about bad karma. Or that was fate's way of telling me cowardice exists for a reason. The bats closed the distance and started swarming around the hill giant, but he refused to acknowledge them in favor of the whimpering target that kept firing bright shiny pulses of magical energy at him. The Dragon Shaman took a piddling swing, but barely scratched the behemoth. The Swashbuckler and kobold both got up and started sprinting back to the fight. With the kobold's move rate, he got almost in range, but not quite. He intentionally stopped shorter than he could have, to keep himself out of the giant's move range, knowing he could close the gap on his next turn if he didn't get himself killed on this one. Wince. The giant bull rushes again, this time knocking the Dragon Shaman from airborne to prone, and right next to me. I fire another Eldritch Blast. The Dragon Shaman breaths fire into the giant's face. Neither roll was very good. We're a little concerned here, because on the giant's next turn, he could realistically power attack and kill either one of us flat, without really breaking a sweat. Which is when the kobold, moving a ridiculous distance lightning fast, makes a charge attack and flings himself at the giant, with nothing but his itty-bitty little sword, strength penalty, and all. Apparently, the giant had exactly 3 hit points left, because 4 was enough to knock him into negatives and make him fall face first in the dirt. Factotum, can I do a one-handed handstand with the grip of the sword sticking out of the hill giant's back, doing gymnast-like poses in midair because I'm just that awesome? DM, I don't see why not. So we all collect ourselves, start healing up those in need. Swashbuckler waved his hands frantically, and figure out what to do now. I ask if I can restitch the dead bat as a weaker version and reanimate it. No dice. A zombie dies when it's not structurally capable of existing anymore. That bat is pulp, says the DM. The Dragon Shaman suggests that I can ride with the Swashbuckler, like he's been riding with the kobold. By weight it should work, especially with me lacking legs. I just sit there moping for a moment, before it hits me. Me, is that hill giant still breathing? DM, he passed his stabilization check, yeah, he's at -3 hit points. Me, I fire an eldritch blast into the base of his skull and start rummaging through my pack for more black onyx. The whole table gave me this face. Me, what? He's large-sized. He's got legs, I need legs. I'm turning him into a skeleton, cracking open his ribcage, and riding around inside of him until something better comes up. The table continues to stare. Me, someone help strap me to his spine and pad his hip bones. So, I got new legs, which is interesting. The DM ruled that it's basically like any other zombie mount. Controlling him takes some of my turn if I want him to do anything tricky, moving is more or less straightforward, dismounting will take twice as long since I'm literally held in place with leather straps. I'd better avoid populated areas until I find a new option. He also can't fly, but his base move rate is better than mine was when I had legs, and it matches the zombie bat's fly speeds. So it'll do for now. Plus he still has his great club. As an aside, after that fight, we leveled up. I basically flipped a coin as to whether or not I was going to take a level of Dread Necromancer or another level of Warlock, but in the end, I decided on staying pure Warlock. My current ride is ridiculously sturdy compared to the bats, and by the time it's a concern, I'm sure we can find other options for mounts for me and the others. Plus Warlock 7 is a good level, I get fiendish resilience to allow me to heal myself, contributing to our overall group hit point total. So imagine our surprise when the severe attention span problem swashbuckler announces that he's taking a few levels in Archivist next. We asked why, and he said you've all got healing, we might as well round it out. Besides, now I can heal everyone's mounts during down times. And I think I want in on this undead action myself. So now he's a swashbuckler 4, sorcerer 2, archivist 1, contemplating staying in archivist until he gains access to animate dead. And now our group has 2 fledgling necromancers. The dragon shaman face-palmed. Edit. I'd also like to point out that we all face-palmed when we realized that throwing the dice from the air and summoning creature to soften up the hill giant would have been way smarter. Our DM even laughed at us and said that's what he'd expected us to do, because the hill giant was a tougher fight than we should have been up against. Hindsight's 20/20ths, right? Picking up where I left off, leveling up on our way to the asylum, this is the tail end of our last gaming session. I should point out that me and the DM basically got together and sat down outside of the game sessions so he could teach me about the asylum, what it had been like, and so on, so I wouldn't fumble and shuffle awkwardly if someone asked me about the backstory. So we trek on towards the asylum. Me and my giant skeleton, who I'm considering getting a giant hooded robe for to try to pass off as some kind of real giant in a pinch, and the rest of the group circling above on our 2 remaining bats, who are in less danger of being destroyed thanks to a few handy-dandy inflict spells. The asylum itself is a massive compound, 3 individual buildings surrounded by 2 layers of wrought iron gates topped with spikes. One of the buildings has a series of towers jutting out from it in random locations. I mentioned that they had cells at the top for high risk of escape patients. The factotum asked how I knew, and I mentioned that the third one from the left had been mine. I drop a little exposition, that the asylum wasn't actually a terrible place. The doctors were mostly holy men of varying degrees, and truly wanted to help. They didn't torture us or anything, I was just high risk because I kept trying to escape. So we press on, and the closer we get, the more something seems wrong. We can hear a really faint echo from inside, sounding like a small group all crying. And the place looks to be abandoned of any activity. When we get to the outer gate, with me staying hidden out among some trees, we can see that, yes, something is definitely off. There's no one. No guards, no doctors, no patients walking in the courtyard. Windows are broken, no movement is occurring inside. The place doesn't look decrepit. It isn't falling apart under the elements just yet, it seems there's no one left. Relatively confident that our riding around with a posse of undead creatures won't draw massive amounts of attention, the flyers land and we all go in through the front gate. The hinges creaking garners us no extra attention. We can still hear crying echoing through the courtyard, and it's getting louder. We pass through the open terrain with no incident. We debate the best place to start searching for information, or the source of the crying, and come to the conclusion that this is one of those times kicking in the front door is not only acceptable, it's borderline desirable. So kick in the front door we do, and rush into the lobby of the asylum and take up defensive positions, darting our eyes everywhere for anomalies. We see papers scattered everywhere, and it's very, very dark, but aside from those two details, everything seems normal. Dusty, clearly unused for weeks, maybe months, but normal. Having been met with no resistance from our SWAT team-style entry, but still clearly hearing faint crying echoing through the halls, we suddenly become much more unsettled, and opted to press on more carefully. We snaked through the abandoned halls, occasionally poking our faces into rooms only to find more of the same scene, papers everywhere, filing desks overturned, as if someone had been searching for something. Finally, we ascended to the second level, and entered a room that had a balcony/walkway circling and overlooking a great hall full of tables and benches. And everywhere we looked, floating apparitions, looking for all the world like incorporeal patients in asylum gowns, weeping and babbling and muttering to themselves in a mad rolling wave. Suddenly, they all noticed us in unison, and began to disperse. Sinking into the floor, floating back through walls, floating into support columns, the crying, insane noises surrounded us, coming through walls and floor and ceilings, and everywhere we looked, we'd see spectral palms just barely breaching the surfaces of everything in sight. Dragon Shaman, how are everyone's fort and will saves these days? Factotum, bad. Swashbuckler, middling. Me, same, not as low as the factotums. Dragon Shaman, I guess I'm on point. Anyone have anything that works especially well against ghosts? Me, nope. It's all got a 50% mischance. Factotum, this is so bad. Which is when one of them raises from the floor in front of us, babbling incoherently. We all roll will saves, but even with using an inspiration point to boost his saving throw, the kobold fails spectacularly. His eyes glaze over and he just stands there, swaying lightly, babbling to himself sadly the same way the ghost had been. The dragon shaman scoops him up and flies out over the grand hall, banking in tight circles to keep him away from the ghosts while he's helpless. The swashbuckler thanks his lucky stars that he took magic weapon as a spell known. He debates on whether or not the spell should go to his own blade, or to my skeleton's great club. The reasoning being that he can make better tactical decisions, but the giant won't stop smacking ghosts around until there are none left, even if we all go catatonic. Eventually he decides to cast it on his own blade, but tells me that if he gets mine snapped or something to have my skeleton grab it ASAP. He quick casts it and swings at the nearest ghost, connecting for a good bit of damage. I fired an eldritch blast at the ghost's face point blank. It went through the mischance, and rolled 1-4, 1-5, and 3 SIXS. I guess my dice knew I was mad at them. It was enough to make the ghostly creature disappear in a sad quiet puff of light. I believe that's when I hummed the Ghostbusters theme song. The dragon shaman was close to getting swarmed by flying apparitions, but a quick check revealed that his breath weapon was a supernatural ability, which meant it could affect the ghosts, with a mischance. He reared up as high as he could and breathed a cone of fire straight downwards, catching as many as he could in the blast. He got 4 or 5 of them, but not enough to destroy any, and the whole group kept pursuing him. The kobold continued to stare in abject horror while babbling like a lunatic. We needed to keep him safe, as he was the only one of us with an attack that could directly affect the ghosts. Opportunistic piety could either turn them, or hurt them outright. Even if he were able to act though, we were definitely getting swarmed by way too many of them for his presence alone to turn the tide. The swashbuckler took a jump onto the edge of the balcony and swung out at the flying cloud of ghosts trying to get the dragon shaman, ignoring the growing cloud of ghosts that were swarming our position. But due to the mischance, his sword just swung through them and caused no real harm. I fired an eldritch blast at the group behind us, but it just blew through them like they weren't there, well, because they weren't. The fight basically went on like that. Hopeless. The kobold finally stopped babbling incoherently at one point, and managed to get off a turn undead, sending 4 of the ghosts screaming and clawing straight down through the floor to escape his divine wrath. Unfortunately, the next turn, the swashbuckler and kobold both failed the will save to avoid becoming babbling messes again, and were both rendered helpless. We were taking wisdom damage left and right. I shouted to the dragon shaman that we needed to book, and fast. He agreed, and banked to the balcony to join the escape. I had my giant skeleton chassis grab the incoherent swashbuckler, and we both started to run back to the front door, carting our helpless compatriots along with us. It was daylight outside. If we could just make it back into the sun? Which was about our last thought as the swarm of ghosts finally wisdom drained us into nothing, and sent us into a catatonic restless state full of nightmares and tremors. We woke up from our horrible coma to brand new surroundings. Each of us sat in a plain metal chair, manacled into place, and utterly motionless. We could make out that we were in an office, and we were facing a large desk. A tall bald man with glasses sat scratching at the desk with a pen. A spot check revealed two things. There was no paper. The desk there was almost solid black with repeat applications of ink without any effort to actually record what was there. The second thing we noticed was that we could clearly make out the wall through the man. He sighed, and stopped scratching at the desk with his pen, though the pen just sat there pointed down as if he were still holding it. He rubbed the smooth top of his head and sighed again. We prefer not to have impromptu visitors here, you know. It gets the patients so worked up. Not knowing what to do, the swashbuckler just squeaked out, "Sorry, sir. You might have undone an entire week's worth of treatment for some of our more encouraging ones." The dragon shaman squeaked out, "Yes, sir, sorry, we weren't trying to cause any trouble." The, apparently, ghostly director once again started scratching at his desk with the pen, before sighing again. "Well, there's no sense dwelling on an honest mistake, is there? Tell me, who were you here to visit, anyway?" We paused awkwardly. Before the factotum said, "Actually, we're really just here for information. See, there's a man. Calls himself priest. We think he's been here before, maybe a patient? He's been causing trouble, and we were hoping to find out more about him." The bald man looked up from his desk, startled, and suddenly the monocles holding us in place unlocked and opened all at once. The director laughed, and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were constables. My mistake. We should have been expecting you back, what with all the trouble occurring here." We all rubbed our wrists, and I looked around for my giant skeleton. He was nowhere to be seen. The director continued, "A patient here, you say? Come with me, we'll check the Hall of Records and see what we can't find out for you." I sat awkwardly for a minute before the dragon shaman offered to carry me piggyback. Humiliating, but I was grateful for the help all the same. So the four of us cautiously trailed the ghostly director as he floated down the dark and abandoned halls of the former asylum. Everywhere we looked, we would see the occasional pair of eyes, or even a face, pressing out of the walls and furniture, watching us closely. Occasionally we'd see a spectral doctor or orderly keeping tabs on us as well. Finally we made it to the Hall of Records. Drawers slammed open in unison and papers began flying out in a rapid wave, circling the room as if a small tornado had been let loose. The director asked, "Priest, you said? I'm terrible with names, always have been, but I'm not finding any records of a man named Priest serving as a patient here. I'm much better with faces, perhaps you could describe him." When he said that, I made a point of looking down and back, covering my face a little behind the dragon shaman's head. The swashbuckler fielded the question. As soon as he said the phrase, "horrible grin," the papers all stopped flying and immediately settled on the floor. The director looked at us with a mixture of recognition and sadness. "Oh," he said, as a whole new set of drawers slammed open, and a whole new set of papers began flying around. One leafed out through the mess and flew in front of our group. The kobold snatched it, and began to skim it. The director went on, "Priest wasn't a patient. He was sent here as a temporary aid from the church. He was only with us for a few weeks before this ghastly trouble all began." The kobold nodded, and asked, "Why did they send him?" The director sighed. "One of our patients had a problem. We were doing all we could to help her, and keep her from escaping. But it seems we let her down on both counts." I buried my face deeper into the dragon shaman's back. "She sold her soul, it seems, in a bid for dark powers. Used them to escape in the middle of the night. We never could get the markings off her cell. Seems the shadows and symbols in the process burned themselves clean into the walls and floor. After so many years of trying to remove the markings, Priest came in to examine the cell and learn more about what had occurred. But after a few weeks, well, everything went to hell one night. We're still trying to sort through the whole mess, you see. The cells in the East Wing caught the worst of it. Ghastly, ghastly business." The swashbuckler asked what had happened to the East Wing. The room we were standing in faded to pitch black, and suddenly when the lights faded back in, we were standing in a different room. Only this one had suffered serious fire damage. So serious that sunlight streamed in through a few weak holes in the ceiling. The director floated cautiously between them. The fire struck at the same time half of the patients began some kind of riot. That's why we're trying so hard to keep them from getting worked up now. We don't want a repeat of that unfortunate night. Thankfully, most of them seem to have forgotten what happened. We started floating out into the burned-out shell of the hallway. Doors lined either side. And inside each cell, we could see an identical scene of utter horror and depravity. The cells were all burned out as well. But each of them contained a single corpse, nailed to the floor on top of some kind of strange symbol, that looked like a bird made of fire. Their heads were all facing the cell doors, upside down, mouths opened in a charred scream. The director said I try not to speak of it in front of the others. But my own personal belief is that this priest character somehow found out how our patient had sold her soul. Found the raw mechanics and actions that transpired, that is. I believe he's taken the souls of these poor patients here. The director stopped to face us. If you can find a way to write this, we would be very grateful. We nodded in agreement. The dragon shaman asked, hesitantly, if the director could tell us any more about the woman who'd sold her soul. I looked at him from across the table, and mouthed no, doing the throat-slashing gesture. The DM just smirked. All three of us kind of glared at the dragon shaman then, with an expression of angry disbelief. It was pretty obvious I was the escapee that had sold her soul. The dragon shaman was just stirring up trouble. The director gave a few more details. She heard voices, kept trying to escape. The director had done everything he could to help, but in the end had failed her. According to the guards, she officially sold her soul one night, and by the time they could open the door to intervene, she'd already used her newfound powers to blast open the lock on the window, climb down the tower wall on the outside, and sprint off into the night. Which is when, as I'm sure even dead people have guessed by now, the director his head looking at me. A wry smile crosses his face, and all he says is "Oh. Welcome home." Before the entire group is once again swarmed by wisdom-draining apparitions. We ran. We made it about 30 feet. Before we each woke up, this time separated, in various predicaments. We still had all of our gear, fortunately. The DM went around the table describing what we saw when we woke up. The swashbuckler woke to absolute blackness. He thanked his lucky stars that he had a light cantrip, and cast it, only to discover that he was in some kind of featureless pit with a trapdoor above him. They'd thrown him into some kind of solitary confinement pit. He managed to two-handed power attack the door hard enough to knock it clean open, which drew a lot of attention from the orderlies who began floating after him. But a good acrobatic jump, a climb up through the door, and he was sprinting towards the nearest window. He took a few wisdom-draining attacks from ones that got too close, but was moving really quickly, despite the cluttered and difficult terrain, before he finally tucked and rolled through the window, taking some slashing damage in the process. Still, he was home free. The ghosts didn't chase him into the sunlight. He jogged around to the front courtyard, naturally, taking note that the sun was indeed starting to set. The kobold woke up in the middle of the hall we were first attacked in. Completely surrounded by the ghosts of former patients, who all seemed very busy doing nothing. None of them were paying him any regard. Probably because he wasn't actually doing anything. He was afraid to move, but he took advantage of his shadow template ability to hide in plain sight, and made a high-rolled check to sneak the heck out of there. He managed to make it to the front courtyard without blowing a single roll, and ran out into the protective daylight around the same time the swashbuckler did. My situation was a little tougher. I woke up in my old cell, charred arcane symbols and all, with two ghost orderlies watching me from the doorway. I dragged myself over to the window and looked down, only to see the surface was facing away from the sunlight, and that ghostly hands were reaching out through the wall and skimming back and forth across it slowly. Spider climbing down was clearly not an option. Fortunately, the undead bats in the courtyard were still under my control, even if we considered them the kobold and swashbuckler's mounts. I called for them to come to me, and waited until they were in sight before blasting open the lock on the window. The orderlies moved to attack me, but I managed to drag myself up and over the edge of the window in time to go tumbling out and onto the back of one of the bats, flying around to the front courtyard myself. It is the obvious meet-up point in that kind of situation, after all. Once in the courtyard, I could see my hill giant skeleton standing in through the front doorway, from when we'd almost successfully escaped. He'd been waiting motionless the entire time, like a good mindless creature. I called him out, and had my friends help strap me back inside of him. The dragon shaman actually woke up in a padded cell. He tried running against the door repeatedly in an effort to knock it over, but he wasn't quite strong enough. In the end, he wound up torching the outer wall with his fire breath, taking cover against the doorway, and taking some wisdom-draining attacks of his own in the process, until enough of the wall had burned away that he took a flying leap at the top section, bursting out into the open air and flying around the outskirts of the gate. Once we were all together, we agreed that an immediate departure was called for, as the setting sun meant the ghosts wouldn't be confined to the building any longer. We debated setting fire to the building, but thought the most prudent course of actions was to simply run for our lives and back to our boat. Those who fight and run away, after all. So now we're caught up before tomorrow night's session, smiley face, hope it's even better. Last night's session. It was a doozy. Fortunately, I managed to get the entire thing written up. So we collectively agreed on something for the first time in a while. It's high time we go poke our nose back to the villain's main base and see what trouble we can stir up. We still haven't decided what we're actually going to try to accomplish when we get there, but we can worry about that later. Or quote the swashbuckler, once again blurring the line between bravery and idiocy. So we set sail from the Northern Empire continent, and head off back to the Egyptian lands. The trip itself is relatively brief and uneventful, once again made more brief by the fact that our skeletal crew labors tirelessly while the rest of us are tucked in our bunks at night. When we get close enough to the Egyptian continent that we can start to make out the shoreline and the port that we last escaped this place from, we start to circle in place instead of charging in full steam ahead, circling in the open waters for a few hours until nightfall. We're concerned that they haven't forgotten either our ship, or our faces, not to mention the whole undead monstrosity thing I'm riding around in. So we wait until darkness falls, and send the kobold on a bat flying in to do a little scouting out of the city. We all wait patiently on deck while he flits about on silent wings in the dead of night, and finally returns to us with the news. There's no one there. Swashbuckler, like, everyone's gone home for the night and left the place unguarded. The kobold look at him blank and repeats, there's no one there. The city's empty. So, well, crap. We opt to stop circling aimlessly in the open waters, and pull into the city at large. We dock and tie up the ship, and a glance around reveals that the kobold was 100% correct. The place is deserted. Me, on the plus side, I don't have to be sneaky with my skeleton. The dragon shaman gave me a sideways glance, but agreed that it did make our approach much easier, considering the only one of who could blend in isn't exactly the master of diplomacy, Swashbuckler. We go in cautiously, sending the kobold to ghost a few hundred feet in front of us before giving us the clear. About halfway through the city, we realize it really is deserted, and rather suddenly. But not so suddenly they didn't have time to lock their doors and make sure everything was in proper order. I had the kobold pick the lock on what looked like a tailor's shop. The dragon shaman insisted that we were not looting this city, even though we were already wanted criminals who would be executed, and I reluctantly agreed to leave behind some gold for whatever I took. I wasn't after much, just a huge black cloak and brooch for my giant skeleton, and some dresses that would work to conceal my lack of legs once I had fell flight, and would fit over my leather armor with some minor alterations. Since I was shopping, the swashbuckler and kobold thought maybe it would be a good idea if we started sneaking into shops to restock our gear. We were definitely behind on normal supplies, and this was the first time we'd stopped at any civilized place for weeks. It happened to be empty, but it was still a civilized place. At first the dragon shaman didn't like the idea, until he looked down and noticed he was still using the same beat-up 8 gold costing Morning Star he'd had since level 1. He reluctantly agreed that it was probably a good time for a resupply run, and that we might as well take advantage of the lack of being tried as wanted criminals to grab some new gear. He'd been taking armor and weapon proficiency feats for lack of better immediate options, so this was something he, outside the game, was kind of looking forward to. I know. He swapped out his cruddy beat to crap Morningstar for a masterwork bastard sword. He also found a suit of masterwork full plate that, with some relatively minor modifications, was suitable for him to wear, what with the wings and all. He came up a tiny bit short on the gold for all of it, but gave himself a trying to be a hero 10% off discount. Fortunately, the sword/shield/armor combo is light enough that he can still fly normally, but he won't be carrying any of us casually unless he pumps his strength some more. The rest of us spent our loose coin on some scrolls and potions, a spellbook to serve as our fledgling archivist's prayer book, some better armor and weapons for ourselves, nothing too special. Some more daggers for me, better fitting leather armor for the kobold, a masterwork rapier for the swashbuckler, and he found a masterwork buckler with no arcane spell failure chance. And yes, we gave ourselves varying discounts as well. Our little shopping detour was interrupted when we heard a haggard cough echoing down the streets. We sent the swashbuckler first, since he was currently the only one who could pass for normal, with us trailing a few feet behind. We pinpointed the noise to one of the alleys in between buildings, and creeping down, we noticed who was making the noise. A homeless man, obviously completely blind, and laying in a pile of filthy rags. He blended in so well, that if we hadn't noticed the noise, we never would have spotted him. He was clearly dying, infected with something horrible. Not wanting to touch him due to fear an infection, and all of us lacking any kind of way to remove a disease. We could produce healing effects, but not remove disease. I reached out with the giant skeleton hand to pat him softly on the arm and made a hushed noise to alert him to our presence. When he reached to grab the wrist of the skeleton, and felt bone instead, he gasped, and asked, "Is this the Reaper coming to free me from this life?" The dragon shaman said, "Not quite yet, friend. Tell me, where has everyone gone?" The homeless man drew a ragged breath and told us, the plague had spread through the city like an uncontrolled fire. Everyone was sick, even the healers and holy men had fallen ill. But a man, priest, had promised them a cure. They believed him, followed him out into the desert, where they were beginning a ritual to take the sickness away. No one who'd passed had been willing to help the blind and dying homeless man though, as they figured, rightly, he said, that he was only hours from the end. So we established two things. Priest, despite being obviously unhinged and unnerving, was nevertheless able to convince people he was important enough to let him do as he wished, browse unchecked through mental patient records, lead a church-sponsored archaeological dig, get an entire city to follow him Pied Piper style out to an unearthed ziggurat. The second thing was where we needed to go now. We'd been heading that way anyway, but it was nice to know what to expect. The homeless man wheezed, and asked us if we could do him a mercy. As the dragon shaman was asking, "What's the moral thing to do here anyway?" I put my hand gently on the homeless man's forehead, and fired off an eldritch blast. The dragon shaman's response was, "Oh gee, look at that." Surprise. Bitterness aside, we gathered up our new supplies, left what we didn't immediately need back at the ship, and told the skeletons to pull out of port and return to circling the waters offshore until we came back, playing it safe, did a hit point /status /gear check, and set off in the direction of the ziggurat. We took the bats with us, but walked while they flew overhead. On the way there, we were attacked. Whether it was a chance encounter, or something deliberately prepared, we're not sure, but we were attacked by giant scorpions of various sizes in the open sand. Since it was night, we hadn't noticed them approaching until they were actually in combat range. We managed to wipe them out, and finally leveled up for our troubles. Which means I finally got Fell Flight. The text of Fell Flight says you gain a fly speed equal to your move rate, but the DM was kind enough to give me a fly speed equal to my normal move rate, and not my new, drag yourself 5 feet at a time by your arms, move rate, because that would have just been cruel, even for him. So I eagerly flew out of my skeleton ride and put on one of the dresses, finally back to equal footing among the others, actually technically better footing, as I can move in any direction at will. The swashbuckler took another level of archivist, swash 4, sork 2, arch 2. The kobold elected to stay pure factotum to gain cunning surge, and can now spend inspiration points to take an extra standard action on his turn. The dragon shaman got a stronger breath weapon. All of us got a high enough BAB that we get a second attack each round. And we moved on through the desert. When we arrived at our destination, we found no one around the box canyon directly. But when we got to the edge and looked down, we saw it was absolutely filled with a wave of people. They were all kneeling and facing the ziggurat, crying, and praying for strength. The sounds of the desperate. Some of the less ill were standing guard, holding large falchions and other curved blades. Around the ziggurat directly were several elite-looking warriors. And on top of the ziggurat, priest knelt surrounded by his group of men, leading the people of the city in the ritual prayers. We pulled back away from the edge of the canyon and started talking about our options. None of them seemed very positive. Our primary goal was getting into the ziggurat itself, but ideally we could do that without the entire population of a major port city pursuing us in a rage. The kobold could probably make it in, if he could fly. With a bat though, he'd be obvious, and wouldn't be able to do it stealthily. The full plate wearing Dragon Shaman would be even more obvious. The swashbuckler had no real options other than fighting his way in. I could float out above the ziggurat and drop straight down, but there were enough torches that someone would be bound to notice me, and I can't hide in plain sight like the kobold can. We sigh and scratch our heads. I suggest that I can probably get us in violently. I can control 32 HD worth of undead. Dragon Shaman, no, and I'm only controlling 27 at the moment. Dragon Shaman, no. If the Dragon Shaman can make it down and torch 5 people in his fire breath, Dragon Shaman, no, then I can reanimate them and have them attack anyone nearby. Dragon Shaman, no, and just raise whoever they kill when their numbers start thinning out. Dragon Shaman, no. Hell, if you keep everyone off my back, Dragon Shaman, no, I might be able to take out the whole canyon. Dragon Shaman, no. Swashbuckler, at least it's an idea. Dragon Shaman, no it isn't. Attempted genocide isn't an idea. It's an atrocity. We sigh and scratch our heads. Swashbuckler, go in gangbusters style. Fly down, send the bats careening into the nearest attackers, dash into the entrance and try to seal it behind us so no one can alert whoever's inside. Me, you mean pin ourselves in with a psychotic druid who's shown that he can wipe out the 4 of us casually? I don't think sealing the entrance is what they're worried about, it's what we'll wind up worried about. We sigh and scratch our heads. Factotum, what about a distraction? We could throw the hill giant skeleton down one side of the canyon, maybe light it on fire first. And when everyone's excited and confused, the warlock can fly the 2 of us to the ziggurat opening. We need to be stealthy inside the place anyway. It won't do to have 2 armored tanks trying to sneak through the dark tunnels with us. You could wait guard out here to save our butts when we inevitably come running out in a panic because we got in over our heads. We look around at each other and finally nod. I can make a cloud of darkness that surrounds me, so the 2 of us will just be a darker spot against the night sky. I can drop at 60 feet around, and given the height of the ziggurat as opposed to the drop, it'll be give or take 9 to 12 seconds before I can have us both inside through the doorway. And even if anyone does look away from the flaming skeleton long enough to notice us, we'll just be a shadowy blot that disappears in a few seconds. Yup. That's honestly the best plan we could come up with. Go us. So me and the kobold position ourselves at the edge of the canyon, as close to the entrance to the ziggurat as we can get, while the Dragon Shaman and Swashbuckler get on the other side with the hill giant skeleton. The Swashbuckler coats it in 2 pints of oil. All good adventurers carry rope, oil, and chalk, FYI, and the Dragon Shaman hits it with a fire breath as I give it an order to go toppling over the side of the canyon and, if it survives, start attacking anyone who attacks it. The reaction is, exactly as predicted. Everyone in the canyon, priest, and his men included, look back at the behemoth falling to the canyon floor below. I grab the kobold and start flying down as fast as I can, while the skeleton hits the ground. Between 20d6 fall damage and 5d6 fire damage from the breath, it turned out to be something like 95 points of damage, which meant the skeleton was still up and kicking, well, club smacking, the guards who rushed it in fear and confusion. The ruckus generated was more than enough for me and the kobold to make it into the entrance of the ziggurat unnoticed, and the flaming skeleton killed a pretty high number of guards before they finally took it down. The Dragon Shaman and Swashbuckler both booked to the entrance of the tunnel leading out of the canyon, the one we'd gone up that first time, getting into position to attack whenever anyone came up to figure out what had happened. And we were in. We could both see just fine in the dark, so we didn't have to get any light source or anything that would give us away. We'd been here before, so it was a pretty straightforward sneak job. We didn't get lost or make any pointless detours into empty corridors like the first time. Along the way down though, we noticed something kind of peculiar. The spellcasting bug corpses were everywhere. They looked like they'd been thrown into a wood chipper, and were so shredded it took close examination for us to notice that some of them had parts of them ripped out cleanly. None of the spellcasting gems were to be seen. They'd all either been taken, or expended from the bugs casting them in self-defense. We couldn't tell which. But occasionally, we'd find a partially intact corpse with black onyx haphazardly jammed in where the gems should have been. We say partial because, it looks like after the onyx was pushed in, the bugs wound up being crushed out of frustration. All of this seemed very bad. We came to the great chamber we'd encountered the drifter in before. The high-ceilinged chambers that we kept bumping into him in. Immediately, The kobold started sliding around the outer wall to get further into the chamber, while I, in my dark blot of shadows, floated up the wall and stuck to the ceiling, looking downwards. I noticed spiders and other various insects sticking quietly in the shadows, but none of them noticed me while I floated to a nice safe position that would give me a good view. The scene in the chamber was disturbing, to say the least. The drifter was there, in the middle of everything, surrounded by black onyx and a strange glowing symbol carved into the rock floor. The same symbol was on his forehead, a glowing gold rune. Thurin and the changeling were there too, along with a number of priests' men, who must loan out a few of them to Thurin while they're working together, or something. Which would explain the guys burning themselves to death at the docks in the beginning. They weren't killing themselves, they were just hiding. By killing themselves. Or whatever. The fifth mystery man wasn't present. On the outside of the strange carved symbol, were 13 people from this city, of various ages and genders. They were all bound and gagged, helpless, facing the drifter as his wings buzzed uncomfortably and he muttered quietly to himself. Occasionally, Thurin or the changeling would double-check the bonds on some of their prisoners. There were also 13 jars. Each one filled with a spell-casting bug, each one looking like its back had been torn open. Whatever gems they'd had were gone, replaced by cut crystals of black onyx. The bugs were still alive and well, though extremely agitated. These must have been the successful ones. And on the back wall? Chained and strapped and gagged? The angel. Her eyes were gouged out, but it didn't stop her from turning her head to look directly at the kobold, and then up at me on the ceiling, before returning her gaze straight ahead and giving a defiant tug at the chains holding her to the ground. She knew we were here, and presumably, she gave that one subtle tug at her bonds as a way of telling us to free her. Angels aren't known to be quitters, I suppose. A closer look at the center of the chamber revealed one of the angel's eyes laying on the ground, facing directly north at the tip of the strange symbol. The kobold crept alongside Thurin/priest's workers, checking them for keys or anything that would help him free the angel. He found nothing, and elected to go and begin picking the locks on the chains directly. There wasn't much I could do from the ceiling. I could fire a blast at someone to disrupt things, but it would be suicide for me, and I'd be taking the kobold down with me. The kobold managed to spring one of the locks, but the DCS were really high. He was forced to take 20 to get some of them, and there were a good number of locks. As he was working on freeing the captive celestial, I was watching the ritual starting to go down, still trying to think of anything I could do to stop it that wouldn't just get us destroyed. After thorough examination of my abilities and gear, I came up with diddly squat. All I could do was watch and hope the kobold managed to spring the angel. The drifter finally stopped muttering to himself, and nodded at the changeling, who proceeded to walk around, cautiously opening the jars containing the black onyx bugs. When she opened each one, they honed in directly on the drifter himself, and, apparently began to chew their way into him. The first one caused him to flinch and grind his teeth, but he simply stayed where he was with a steely resolve, until the fifth one started chewing on him. Then he finally winced and cried out in pain, falling to one knee while his wings fluttered aggressively, and the constant swarm of smaller bugs around him began to buzz around, agitated. The changeling hesitated to open the sixth jar, and Thurin simply asked "Sir," with a concerned echo, but the drifter cried out in pain again and glared at the changeling, barking at her to keep going. She looked very worried. So did Thurin. The drifter simply scowled and gritted his teeth more. The changeling ran from jar to jar. By the 10th one, the drifter began screaming out in pain, which even made Thurin look uncomfortable, looking around nervously and trying not to focus on the sound. The kobold sprang another few locks. By the time the changeling had opened the 13th jar, and all 13 black onyx bugs were attacking the drifter, he was freely screaming in pain, rolling in place and trying to fight off the bugs. The changeling and Thurin kept exchanging nervous glances. The prisoners looked catatonic with terror. The kobold sprang the last lock, and disappeared back into the shadows, after patting the angel between the wings to let her know he was done. She remained in place, too clever to give it away that easily and risk being recaptured. The drifter stopped screaming in pain. He stopped screaming in pain, because apparently, the bugs had done him in. All 13 of them had chewed and chewed until he'd finally bled out, and was laying in the middle of the symbol, his blood pooling out and flowing through the cracks of it while the bugs continued to feed on his corpse. Thurin shuffled uncomfortably and the changeling backed nervously towards the exit. They weren't 100% on the situation either, apparently. When the drifter's blood finally pooled into the entire symbol, the golden rune on his forehead stopped glowing, and the symbol on the floor flashed gold instead. And when it did, all 13 of the bugs immediately fell onto their backs and went into death throes, curling their legs tight as they perished, only to flip themselves back over and stand motionless. After what seemed like too long of a pause, the strange golden symbol on the floor and on the drifter's forehead flashed on the backs of the bugs. At which point they all flew into a frenzy, circling each other angrily before flying out and attacking the 13 bound captives, who also began screaming in pain, until the bugs finally worked their way into the bound victims, causing the same glowing rune to spring up on their foreheads, and then they suddenly stopped struggling. I didn't like where this was going. Thurin, the changeling, and their workers all began circling the group, untying and getting them as quickly as possible. Thurin asked, "Sir, are you alright?" At which point, every get victim spoke in a creepy unified chorus, "Yes. Yes, I just didn't expect it to hurt as much as it did." At which point, everyone present turned their eyes to the angel, only to find her sprinting alongside the outskirt of the chamber, heading towards the exit door. They all screamed various curse words, a great wave of rage coming as they moved to attack her. The spiders on the ceiling all came to and began descending on silk strands, one of them dropping directly in front of the exit. Feeling uncomfortably noble, I gave away my position by firing an eldritch spear at the spider blocking the doorway, allowing the angel a clean escape. The kobold gave away his position too, when he cast grease on the doorway just behind the angel, allowing her to run unhindered while anyone making it to the door began to fall and crawl. I flew towards the front doorway as fast as I could, trying to dodge the spiders and taking hits from some ranged attacks and thrown rocks. One of the group cast contagion on me, but I passed the fort save. Another one had apparently cast some kind of lightning spell, because me and the kobold were both getting struck by bolts of electricity while we booked for the exit. The kobold managed to make a running, springing jump over the patch of grease without much problem. I just flew over it. Thurin managed to jump over it too, but the changeling and some of the previously victims all fell prone in the muck. The rest couldn't get through the collapsed bodies, but Thurin was pursuing and howling in rage, and glancing back as we ran for the exit with everything we had. One of the victims in the grease pit had begun a violent coughing fit, coughing up blood, gore, until they literally fell apart in a showering of bone and viscera, revealing a whole swarm of the black onyx bugs from their insides, which began flying out. The others began coughing in the same way.